standards, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to pretty much jump to the writing part pretty quickly. But I do at least want to show you guys kind of what the standards look like, and maybe that will make it a little bit clearer why it's so difficult to figure out where to start sometimes. And Stacy, you're absolutely right. Yeah, we use it as adults, and especially as far as we all have gotten in our education, we aren't being asked to actually talk about the rules. We are just using them. So you forget. But we need to remember that we need to go back and remind ourselves of this, because you do have to be able to explain them in multiple ways. The same rule, 14 different ways for the 14 different students in your class. All right, so here on this slide, you guys have the standards, and I put up both the Common Core state standards and the Texas standards, and I think those are the current ones. Not being in Texas, and I think a lot of you guys are in Texas, which is why I included those. So for Common Core, there are 5 anchor standards, and they all have to do with demonstrating command of conventions, and it is focused specifically on writing. And the first one is grammar and usage. The second one is capitalization, punctuation, and spelling. The third one is language and context, and then included within the language standards is actually vocabulary, which to me is really kind of separate from what we're talking about tonight, unless you're talking about, terminology that students need to know to be able to talk about the parts of a sentence and what they're constructing. So each grade level, according to Common Core, is supposed to tackle a set of supposedly hierarchical skills and ideas. So I use nouns as an example. So, the younger grades start out being able to identify common nouns, and then they move up to proper possessive nouns. Older students are then looking at collective nouns and abstract nouns. And then Texas also has things broken down similar to the standards for Common Core. You've got conventions of academic language. You've got capitalization and punctuation, conventions, and spelling. So vocabulary, at least didn't appear to me, was not incorporated as part of language instruction. But if you look at the very specific things that students are supposed to do at early grade levels, if they don't master those, that's how you end up with students at the higher grade levels that are having trouble talking about the more complex ideas because they don't have the language or the ability to do the basic things. So you're kind of back to, do we need to go back and talk about parts of speech? How do you talk about abstract nouns if you don't even know what a common noun is? So how to fit that in. Sometimes it's just a matter of covering language, and sometimes it's really going back and isolating those parts. And in some cases, you can't hold, well, most cases, you can't necessarily hold an entire class back for students that are really far behind. And sometimes it is helpful to start building up a repertoire of review materials that you can just give to students that need that extra information, or varying homework assignments, or if they have independent work, break that work up into different groups. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about resources. Somebody remind me to talk about breaking resources up by grade level if I don't get to it. Oh, I guess it's my next slide. I thought I put it later. Okay, anyway, so textbooks, workbooks, ESL methods. Even if you're not teaching ESL, sometimes the ESL materials for grammar instruction are actually really helpful, especially if you have students that are struggling. If you're trying to inform yourself, going on an ERIC database, trying to find journal articles about how to teach grammar can be helpful. It's time consuming, but it might be worth your while. Websites are really good, though you have to be careful with websites because sometimes they're not the most reliable. And a lot of times websites that proclaim that they have all of these great language activities and they claim they're at this level or that level, it's not very accurate. Don't forget that our own students' work is actually a good resource, and that's something that I'll get into with the writing portion. Text that the students are reading, and then there's more resources that you guys can use on the handout that I have for you under files. Hold on, let me see if I have it here. I think it's the next slide. Okay, yeah, so this is what I was talking about, and this is why I gave you the 6th grade and the 12th grade pronoun antecedent agreement worksheets. I thought I had this with my ESL stuff, but I didn't. I put it here. So if you are using workbooks and you are trying to vary the level of instruction or trying to provide background for students, really make sure that you look at the level of the workbook. And say you're teaching 12th graders. So I think a couple of you said you had seniors. So if you look at a 12th grade workbook, it's pretty complex. Sometimes stepping back to a 10th grade workbook or a 9th grade workbook will actually make a difference in what students are able to understand. And there's a huge difference even with the same skill between, say, a 5th grade workbook and a 12th grade workbook. The same concept in like the pronoun antecedent agreement, for example, in a 5th grade workbook will be discussed using simpler sentences. It might be framed in terms of autobiographical writing, so nonfiction, but relatively straightforward. It's going to give you examples of tricky antecedents. And there are going to be certain complex rules provided and sentence rewrites. But if you look at the same concept in the same series of workbook, the sentences are much more complex. The examples are framed in terms of reading poetry, and they are examples from real literature or actual literary analysis, which is much harder to read. There aren't any examples provided, so students are expected to just know what they're doing with just the instructions, and they're asked to write original sentences as opposed to just rewrite things. So there's quite a difference in complexity between those. And that's something that if you're looking on websites, you don't necessarily get that slow progression. And depending on what district you're in, I know that the district that I'm in, we do have access to our language textbooks online, and they actually have online activities. So I could, even though I only use the 12th grade textbooks or have those checked out to my students, I can go back and find activities for them to do that are at any grade level within that series. So that's something to keep in mind or look into if you could do that. All right, any comments so far? Any questions regarding standards and what we just talked about? Yeah, and Victor, you're definitely going to have to do that. You're going to be most successful when you direct your instruction at the level that your students are at. And sometimes, if they're not at quote unquote grade level, they can still demonstrate significant growth even if they don't get to grade level. And we need to remember that as teachers. And an easy way to shut students down is expect them to go from, say, 6th grade to 10th grade in the span of a year. It's impossible. Nobody is expected to grow that much. Even if kids are on grade level, they're still only expected to make 1 year's worth of growth. And sometimes it's a struggle to even get a portion of a year's worth of growth, considering all the challenges that we need to face. So, I think we all, need to, make sure that we're analyzing where our students are and at least doing our best to meet them there. One last comment about the resources, something that just to keep in mind. If you are using textbooks and workbooks, which is different than what I'm going to talk about when we jump into the next section about writing, just be aware that the younger your students are, the less they are going to benefit from direct instruction of grammar rules. It doesn't mean that they can't produce things, but that abstract discussion of rules is going to be more difficult for them just developmentally because they may not be ready to talk about it or process that. So sometimes you need to kind of break the concepts down into smaller chunks, walk them through slower. Sometimes you need to change the language. And I know that as teachers, we're supposed to get our students used to academic language, and we want them to recognize that academic language when they have to take those high stakes tests. But if they're not understanding in class what we're asking them to do, then make sure that we modify language so that they can at least understand the concept, even if they aren't using the right terms, because you'll get them there. And I know a lot of times workbooks and textbooks get a bad rap as far as being boring, don't use them, you have to do everything in the context of their own writing or, real use, but they have their place. They do have their place. It's just not something that you shouldn't have that as your only method for teaching language or something that you do all day, every day. And yes, Victor, diagnostic tests. And if they really struggle on your first diagnostic test across the board, then maybe you need to back them up and give them a slightly easier diagnostic test, and you might get a more accurate read of where they are. Other than that, well, they're definitely not here. Takes more time, but it might be worth the effort. All right. Skill sheets. Yes, I like that, Grace. That's good. They're not handouts. We don't do handouts. Okay. So if we are going to talk about teaching language in the context of writing, we need to back up and think about what are the components to writing well in terms of language use. And I did my best to kind of come up with a pretty general list here that would apply to pretty much every grade level in varying degrees of complexity. So precise diction, or if you have younger students, then maybe it isn't called precise diction, using descriptive words. Good, clear explanation with details and examples. Limited wordiness, so the writing is clear. Active versus passive constructions as far as sentence structure goes, and limited mechanics and editing errors, including spelling, punctuation, and capitalization. So that's what we expect out of our skilled writers at any grade level. So how do we go about producing that type of writing and focusing instruction within that frame of this is what you need to do when you are writing for multiple purposes? You may introduce an idea with skill sheets, but most of the actual work would be done with actual student writing samples or real world samples of writing in the form that you're asking students to write. So to do that, you would need to spend a significant amount of time looking at student writing samples and trying to identify common errors and prioritizing those errors so that you can address the issues in a timely way that are going to help the most students. So if you identify, for example, that your students have a huge amount of trouble with fragments, then you would need to actually teach what a fragment is and how to fix a fragment within their actual writing. And a really highly recommended method, anywhere you look to do this, is through sentence combining. And there's a website that I have listed there at the bottom of the slide, and I did put that on the resource handout too. That gives you kind of a rundown of the information that I have on this slide too. Okay, so sometimes really sitting down and nitpicking student writing samples is hugely time consuming. So I gave you guys here a list of what I can deduce are the most common errors students make in writing pretty much across the board. So one class may have more errors of one type than another, but in a pinch, when you're sitting there looking at your stack of 150 essays and it's 11 o'clock at night and you need to have something ready to go for the next day, you could pick something and say, okay, I know that my students have trouble with this. This sounds good, and go with that. So fragments, run-ons, subject-verb agreement, pronoun antecedent agreement, spelling, passive constructions, long strings of prepositional phrases that make the writing confusing, incorrect word usage, so mixing up words, like they've heard a saying or they've heard a word used and then they either don't spell it correctly or it's not actually the word that they're using. Dangling or misplaced modifiers, and informal language. So again, sentence combining is something that can tackle a whole lot of the issues on that list. So by discussing sentence combining and talking about the different ways that you can combine sentences, you can tackle things like fragments, run-ons. You can tackle punctuation issues, which is actually something that I didn't list on here. You can tackle things like long strings of prepositional phrases, and you can even tackle passive constructions by talking about sentence combining. Things like incorrect word choice, subject-verb agreement, you could introduce in the mix of talking about sentence combining, but the actual act of combining sentences, you could probably do subject-verb agreement too, because if you have one short sentence that is in present tense and another that's in past tense, you could talk about that sort of agreement throughout. It just depends on what individual sentences you're using. So sentence combining could work for a lot. So there are, especially when students start working on trying to actually combine sentences,